This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. The South Korean president is hours away from his first big foreign diplomacy test. He will soon be face-to-face with Donald Trump and hoping to boost U.S. ties without rivaling China. Now, China's holiday paradise Sanya grinds to a halt as Typhoon Kajiki batters southern Hainan. The storm has made landfall in Vietnam, where thousands have been evacuated from the coast. Now, China Evergrande, once the country's biggest real estate firm, gets delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, marking a grim milestone in China's long-standing property crisis. And Japan's Prime Minister riding high on an approval rating surge since July. Shigeru Ishiba boosted by a U.S. trade deal and efforts to rein in soaring rice prices. Also ahead on East Asia Tonight, Taiwan's cabinet set for a reshuffle after the ruling party suffered a setback in polls over the weekend. How will it impact President William Lai's standing, both at home and abroad? Our correspondent Victoria Jen breaks it all down. The South Korean President Myung is in Washington for his first summit with U.S. President Donald Trump. It's a pivotal moment for South Korea's new leader as a decades-old alliance strains under Washington's increasing focus on China, Seoul's biggest trading partner. Now, Mr. Yi says it's difficult for Seoul to accept Washington's push for what it calls strategic flexibility. U.S. troops have long been stationed in South Korea to deter the North. But Washington wants to expand their role to help contain China, especially in a potential conflict over Taiwan. Now, Mr. Trump also wants Seoul to drastically raise its contribution to the upkeep of U.S. troops on its soil. Trade issues also on the horizon. The two sides have yet to agree on details of a trade deal in July that slashed U.S. tariffs to 15%. For more on this, our senior correspondent, Lim Yun-suk, joins us live now from Seoul. So, Yun-suk, Washington wants this strategic flexibility, but just how far do you think Mr. Yi will go without provoking China or a backlash at home, and also without agreeing to a higher cost share?
Well, very difficult tasks for President Lee Jae-myung when he meets President Trump, because, President Lee Jae-myung faces this delicate balancing act on this strategic flexibility, because now the U.S. has officially said recently that the U.S. troops based here will be remaining focused on the Korean Peninsula. It will also support the broader objectives of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which means that it can be used for missions in places like the South China Sea or even Taiwan. Now, here in South Korea, most of the South Korean people see the U.S. forces as being the protection against Pyongyang and not a global strike force. So if President Lee Jae-myung is seen as agreeing to U.S. operations, not just here on the Korean Peninsula, then, he could face this risk, a political backlash back here in South Korea. But then, it also remains to be seen if he is willing to join hands with the United States and in a way aggravate the situation with China, because China is South Korea's largest trading partner. And South Korea remembers how China punished the country when the U.S. defense missile shield, so-called THAAD, was deployed here on the Korean Peninsula in 2017. Now, South Korea's companies doing businesses in China, and the country too, was very badly hit by China then. And so there are worries that if South Korea takes it could trigger this repeat of that retaliation by China. And then, there's the money issue, like you said. When experts here are saying that it is true that South Korea realizes that it will have to increase its defense spending, but realistically, how much room does South Korea have? And that was a question that came up and asked to one expert here in Seoul. And this is what he told the foreign media on Monday when he was asked about this.
South Korea currently we spend 2.3% of GDP, but it is allegedly known that some of the American media mentioned that South Korea we should pay 3.8%, and some other people say that we have to pay 5%. So I can clearly say that this is a very daunting challenge for South Korea.
So experts here are saying that President Lee Jae-myung will have to be very careful as to what he says, use very, careful language, and he could talk about alliances, regional stability, but, many here are saying that he is unlikely to agree to U.S. forces joining missions beyond the Korean Peninsula. So, he'll have to play his cards right, reassure Washington about the strong alliance, but also not provide Beijing, let Beijing take this opportunity to take some kind of retaliation against South Korea.
So, careful language aside and beyond those tariffs, I'm just curious to know what sort of real economic gains can Mr. Yi actually push for, and can we expect any deals to be sealed?
Well, President Lee Jae-myung will be looking for ways to sort of give the U.S. what it wants in exchange for those defense spending and other issues that will be put on that agenda. Now, he will be looking for ways to solidify what the U.S. has said earlier on the tariffs, because right now there is no official agreement signed between the two sides when they agreed on the 50% tariff. And the U.S. is expected to put pressure on South Korea on other issues too. But, many experts here think that South Korea can deliver to the U.S. Many other things, and it should use that. And one of that is to help President Trump achieve one of his top priorities, and that is to rebuild the U.S. shipbuilding industry. Now, Mr. Trump has said many times before and has raised the prospect of working with South Korea, which is the world's second largest shipbuilder after China. And that's why experts are saying that this is something that South Korea can deliver and is prepared to deliver. And in fact, the South Korean government officials here have called this sort of like Make American Shipbuilding Great Again project. And whether it's going to be acquiring U.S. shipyards by South Korean firms or constructing new shipyards in the U.S., this is a thing that South Korea will likely be discussed. And many experts saying that it's going to be a bargaining chip, a very important one for South Korea. And so, this could work very well in South Korea's favor. And in fact, President Lee Jae-myung is planning to go to Philadelphia and visit a South Korean firm there, Hainan Ocean, which last year acquired a U.S. shipyard. Now, on energy exports, the U.S. wants to expand this LNG and oil exports. And in fact, South Korea has agreed to purchase $100 billion worth of LNG and other energy exports of products from the United States over the next 4 years. And that was agreed under that deal agreed in July. So it is very possible that during this summit, the two leaders could decide on how much energy South Korea will be willing to import from the U.S., every year while President Trump is in the power. But though there are critics here who is arguing that it's not going to be easy, because right now, most of South Korea's energy supply is locked in with producers in the Middle East. And they do dominate the market. And so if South Korea wanted to buy more from the United States, then it means having to cut supply from other countries.
All right, and there's a big summit happening in 6 hours' time. Thanks so very much for that report. Lim Yun-suk speaking to us from Seoul. Now, earlier we also spoke to Young-wook Ryu from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and he explains to us why he thinks President Yi's diplomatic strategy will be tested during his meeting with President Trump.
The Tokyo summit with the Japanese Prime Minister went very well as it set the tone and direction of the bilateral relationship. But the real test for Lee's pragmatic diplomacy will come when he meets Trump. And there are a number of big items. One is to finalize the terms of the tariff agreement. So last month, South Korea and the USA agreed to a 15% tariff deal, but almost immediately when they announced the agreement, different interpretations came up, which mainly concern market access to agriculture and non-tariff trade barriers. Both sides are still disputing the exact terms of their trade agreement. Another item relates to security. And here there are two sub-issues. One is about increasing South Korea's defense budget. The U.S. is asking Seoul to increase its defense spending up to 5% of its GDP from the current 2.3%. But this is very difficult for President Lee to accept, especially given the sluggish South Korean economy and the government financial situation. However, the Korean government is willing to increase its share of the defense budget, so maybe there is some agreement to be made. The other specific issue relating to security is how to modernize and reorientate the ROK, the U.S.-ROK alliance. here the U.S. is pushing Seoul to do more for regional security, especially in promoting the U.S. strategic goal of containing China. Specifically, they are asking Seoul to include a mention of China in their joint communique or press statement, whereas the Lee government wants the alliance to focus more on peace and stability of the Korean Peninsula and to avoid any mention of China, because it might upset, right, the Lee's strategic goal of taking a balanced approach between U.S. and China. Now, all this is very important, not just for South Korea, for the region as a whole.
Well, you've talked about, where the two sides stand on various issues, but can we focus on game plan here, specifically the tactics that the United States will employ to pressure South Korea for steeper defense contributions? And you say President Lee is under quite a bit of challenge. So how is South Korea then preparing its negotiating position in this regard?
So basically, I think that what the U.S. is trying to do vis-a-vis its allies is to utilize the allies' military dependence on the United States to take advantage for the USA in trade and other areas. The South Korean government's approach to achieve successful negotiation outcome with the United States is to convince the USA that South Korea can help the USA to achieve some of its political and economic goals. So in your coverage, you mentioned nuclear facilities where South Korea has significant capabilities to manufacture these nuclear plants. When it comes to shipping, the U.S. manufacturing in the shipping area is pretty weak, and this is another area where South Korea can help the United States. So the Korean government approach is to tell the Americans that we are on your side, although we don't want to mention China specifically in any joint statement, but we can help you achieve your general strategic and economic goals. And that's going to be President Lee's approach when he meets Trump.
Professor, I want to ask you about North Korea and in particular President Yee's pragmatic approach that you've mentioned towards Pyongyang. Trump himself appears to favor engagement with Kim Jong-un as well. So could this lead to a strategic change in how the U.S. and South Korea deal with the North, particularly from a military standpoint?
Right. So if you remember, when Trump was president for the first time, we had a Trump, Kim Jong-un, and a progressive Korean president in South Korea. Now, when Trump became president again, we have the same combination of Trump, Kim Jong-un, and yet another progressive government in South Korea. So the general direction and policy preference of both Trump and South Korean leader is to engage with North Korea with the hope to entice North Korea to come to the international community to become a normal country. However, here, I think a prior condition has to be the resolution of Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, as you know, in recent month and year, North Korea-Russia military partnership has developed to such an extent that unless we see a resolution in Ukraine, which will lead to some political improvement between U.S. And North Korea, I don't anticipate any significant move to be made on the North Korean issue.
Well, before President Lee flew to the U.S., he sent a special envoy to China, expressing hopes to normalize relations and boost economic cooperation. Now, China is South Korea's largest trading partner, but a row erupted last year after former President Yoon Suk-yeol accused China of interfering in South Korea's elections. Beijing also opposes Seoul's deployment of a U.S. missile defense system. South Korea's new government says it wants to pursue strategic cooperation with China while developing its alliance with the U.S. And in response, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi says that expanding cooperation while reserving differences are the right choices. Recovery efforts are underway on China's Hainan island, a day after Typhoon Kajiki brushed past its southern coast. Heavy rain and gale-force winds downed trees and power lines in the resort city of Sanya, where more than 20,000 residents were forced to evacuate. China's Met Agency has downgraded its typhoon warning, but urges local authorities to remain prepared as winds and rain continue to batter the southern coasts of Hainan and Guangdong. Well, after battering southern China, Typhoon Kajiki made landfall on Vietnam's east coast. More than 500,000 people have been ordered to evacuate. The winds of around 140 kilometers per hour lashing Vietnam's central coastal provinces. Weather authorities are warning of landslides and flash floods around rivers as Kajiki makes its way inland. Thanh Hóa, Nghệ An and Quang Tri provinces are expected to be hardest hit. Kajiki has been likened to Yagi, which killed at least 300 people and caused more than $3 billion in damage in Vietnam nearly a year ago. Now, ahead of Kajiki's arrival, heavy rains blasted the city of Vern as authorities shut 2 airports and recalled all fishing boats.
Phải dùng một từ khủng khiếp. Bây giờ bão chưa vào mà có những khi đứng ở trên nhìn xuống ấy, sông biển có những cơn lên tầm 2 mét. Và hiện bây giờ nước biển ở lên gần đến nước Minh. Việc này là một việc rất kinh khủng. Trong lúc còn bão còn đến, nếu như theo đúng dự báo thì phải còn đến 5 đến 6 tiếng nữa thì bão mới đổ bộ.
Coming up on East Asia tonight, Shanghai taking its cue from Beijing and easing some of the property buying curbs for outer-lying areas in a city. And Taiwan's TSMC steering clear of using Chinese tools in its most advanced chip plants. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia tonight. You are just in time for some business news with Roland Lim. And Roland, China Evergrande, which is once a symbol of China's property boom, that has been delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Quite a stunning fall, it seems.
Indeed, it was. Evergrande's fall from grace marks one of the most high-profile casualties of China's real estate crisis, leaving investors, creditors and home buyers facing deep uncertainty. The delisting marks the end of a 16-year public trading life of what was once China's largest real estate developer. The company's path to delisting began in late January of last year, when the Hong Kong court ordered the company's assets to be seized and sold to pay back its debt. Evergrande's failure to produce a viable restructuring plan to clear its mountain of debt also led to the suspension of its share trading. Now, that suspension has now lasted more than 18 months, which, under Hong Kong rules, is a key reason for the delisting. Its fall ends a golden era of China's real estate sector. Evergrande was once worth $51 billion at its peak in 2017. It's now just valued at about $280 million. Its shares also once fetched as high as 30 Hong Kong dollars. Its stock had fallen to about 16 Hong Kong cents when it last traded more than a year ago. Evergrande was the world's most heavily indebted real estate developer when the court handed down that liquidation order last year. It owed $300 billion to banks and bondholders. Out of that, liquidators have so far sold about $255 million of Evergrande's assets. Court-appointed liquidators recently said any hopes for a holistic restructuring for the firm may be out of reach after they discovered that Evergrande's debt load is far bigger than previously estimated. The next date to watch for Evergrande is a court hearing on September 2nd for its ongoing winding up proceedings. The city of Shanghai is easing some property curbs as the nation as a whole still struggles with a sluggish property market. Shanghai is allowing eligible families to buy an unlimited number of homes outside the outer ring road. Single adults can also enjoy the eased measures, meaning that they would also be treated as families. The adjustments are set to take place tomorrow. The move follows Beijing's lifting of home purchase restrictions in outer-lying areas earlier this month. Property shares in Hong Kong are surging on the news. China Wanke close to 10%, I should say, and Sunac China 6.6 in the green, Longfor Group more than 5% up for the day. Chinese shares jumped, extending a recent bull run as abundant liquidity continued to fuel gains. At the close of market, Shanghai Composite Index was up 1.5%, and that is its best close since August 2015. Shenzhen Component also ending the day 2.26% higher, and the Hang Seng Index surging around 2%. The tech sector was among the key contributors to the Hang Seng's gain. The tech index rose 3.14%, with strong moves seen by EV maker NIO, which gained more than 14%, and semiconductor electronics manufacturer ASMPT adding 7.6%. China's rare earth producers also surging. Among its top movers is magnet supplier JL Mag Rare Earth, climbing as much as 20% in Hong Kong. On the mainland, China Northern Rare Earth Group and China Rare Earth Resources, as well as Zhejiang Zhongke Magnetic Industries, logging solid gains. The boost coming after the government fleshed out plans for stricter controls on the sector over the weekend. Authorities are pushing for a system to better track all domestic supply, including a requirement to send regular output data to the government. Elsewhere in the region, strong gains also seen on the Taiwan weighted index, which advanced more than 2%. South Korea's Kospi index also gaining 1.3, while Japan ending the day up 0.4. China's central bank set up the yuan's daily reference rate against the dollar at the strongest level in more than 9 months, as bets on rate cuts by the Federal Reserve grow following a dovish pivot by its chair. Swan Tek Kin, who is head of research at UOB, weighs in on how China's central bank may react to the likely easing next month.
For the PBOC itself, our view is that it's going to be, I think, pedaling back a bit on the rate cuts. It's not going to be too aggressive in terms of its rate easing. Even with the Fed going to take some actions, I think pretty much these two economies or large markets are operating on their own terms. Particularly for China, there is this deflationary kind of pressures going on, and also excess capacity and involution that people talk about with this price cutting. Later this week, we'll have some idea how that is going to affect big companies. But suffice to say, I think the PBOC probably will stay put for now with this rate easing and let the economy run its own course with all the previous easing measures having taken place already. And then we'll see how the data can catch up and provide a bit more clarity before PBOC would take any action on that front.
Shares of Chinese state-owned automaker Dongfeng Motor skyrocketing 54% today after shooting up as much as 69% at the open. Trading in its shares resumed after 2 weeks of suspension. Investors are cheering the automaker's long-awaited restructuring plans. The parent Dongfeng Motor Corp announced over the weekend it would take the automaker private in a deal worth 555 billion Hong Kong dollars. That's about 7 billion US. The plan involves withdrawing its Hong Kong shares and creating a new stock listing for its Voya line of luxury new energy vehicles. It will pay stakeholders $6.68 Hong Kong per share. That represents a 12% premium to the automaker's last close on August the 8th, before trading on the stock was halted. The move comes as China's automakers are locked in a bruising years-long price war that has raised costs and squeezed margins. Regulators in Beijing have recently stepped up scrutiny of the intense competition and shown encouragement to consolidation in the industry. Taiwan's biggest chip maker, TSMC, adapting to not getting caught in the crosshairs of US-China rivalry. It is phasing out Chinese-made equipment in its most advanced plants. Nikkei Asia says the move is aimed at avoiding possible US restrictions that could disrupt production. TSMC will reportedly not use Chinese tools to produce the world's most advanced 2-nanometer chip, which is set to begin production this year in the Taiwanese cities of Hsinchu and Kaohsiung. The third plant also being built in Arizona that will eventually make these chips. The decision comes as US lawmakers push for rules that could bar chip makers receiving American funding from using Chinese equipment. The Nikkei reports that TSMC is also reducing its use of Chinese supplies in Taiwan and the US, while still working with local suppliers in China for its operations there. And that is the latest in business. Ocheli.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Time now for another break, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, Taiwan's cabinet set for a reshuffle after the ruling party suffered a setback in recent polls. Our correspondent with more on the impact on President William Lai's standing. And support for Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba surges despite his party's poor showing at recent elections. This is East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Hours to go before South Korean President Lee Jae-myung meets the American leader at the White House, hoping to boost U.S. ties without riling top trading partner China. Recovery efforts underway in China's Hainan province, a day after it was battered by Typhoon Kajiki. The powerful storm has made landfall in Vietnam. And real estate firm China Evergrande delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, marking a grim milestone in China's long-standing property crisis. Taiwan President William Lai is expected to announce a cabinet reshuffle with the revised lineup to be finalized within the week. Well, this comes on the heels of yet another setback at the ballot box for his ruling Democratic Progressive Party. Now, before delving into the implications of Saturday's results, here's CNA's Victoria Jen with a recap of the day's votes.
The outcomes are mixed, but the signals are clear. It was called the double vote day, held outside the regular electoral cycle. Voters were asked to decide on two issues. First, whether to restart a nuclear power plant, just months after Taiwan completed its phase-out of nuclear energy. Second, the fate of 7 opposition lawmakers in recall votes initiated by civic groups, aligned with the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. More than 4 million people turned up to vote in the nuclear referendum, failing to meet the threshold of 25% of eligible voters. But over 70% of those who came out to vote on Saturday supported restarting the Ma'anshan plant, which would bring nuclear power back to the island and deal a blow to the DPP's nuclear-free agenda. Meanwhile, all recall attempts against opposition lawmakers from the KMT failed. This was the second round of recalls aimed at shifting the balance of power in parliament back to the DPP. But like the first wave in July, which targeted 25 opposition politicians, the effort ended in another resounding defeat. President William Lai said he accepted the results, calling them democratic choices made by the Taiwanese people, while Beijing responded by saying the failed recalls proved that Taiwanese people once again rejected what it called the DPP's attempt to suppress dissent and divide society.
For more, we are joined now by CNA's Victoria Jen in Taipei. So, Victoria, he has accepted the results, but what does it say about President Lai's domestic standing?
Well, President Lai's approval rating has plunged to a new low to 28% since taking office. He's now talking about a minor cabinet reshuffle after this defeat. Now, it's a way of showing that he's listening and trying to reset his agenda. So far, cabinet members, including the economic minister and digital minister, have already resigned. But make no mistake, this is a big setback for the ruling DPP. None of the opposition lawmakers were unseated, so the KMT and the Taiwan People's Party will still control the legislature. That means Lai doesn't have the numbers to get his policies and reforms through easily. What makes this more damaging is the sense that Lai has misjudged public sentiment. Voters not only rejected the recalls, they also sent a warning on energy. Even though the nuclear referendum didn't pass legally, over 4 million people supported restarting the nuclear power plant. That goes to show how frustrated that the people are with the government's anti-nuclear stand, especially as electricity demand rises. So the challenge for Lai is twofold. He is locked in a divided legislature, and he's under pressure from voters who feel he's not listening.
A cabinet reshuffle may buy him some time, but he has to show that he can recalibrate before these setbacks define the early part of his presidency.
So it sounds like the president has quite a lot on his plate. But in the meantime, we know that Beijing sees President Lai as a separatist. How do you think the results will affect cross-strait relations?
Well, Beijing jumped on the outcome straight away. A spokesperson for Taiwan's affairs office said the failed recall showed that the DPP's efforts to suppress dissent and divide society had no public support. They went further, saying that any push for independence is bound to fail. So for China, this is a chance to frame Lai as weak at home and out of touch with his people. Analysts say that the narratives matters because it gives Beijing more space to pressure Taiwan internationally, and it lets them question Lai's credibility on the world stage. In other words, what happened at the ballot box isn't just about Taiwan's domestic politics. It also feeds directly into Beijing's narrative that Lai is ineffective and isolated, a perspective he'll now have to work hard to counter, both in parliament and on the international stage.
Many thanks for that report. CNA's Victoria Jan live from Taipei. Now, a South Korean special counsel team is aiming to indict former First Lady Kim Kyung-hee on charges of bribery and corruption. Ms. Kim's court-approved detention expires Sunday. She was detained 2 weeks ago over allegations of stock manipulation and meddling in candidate nominations in the 2022 and 24 elections. She was also cited for accepting luxury gifts from the Unification Church in exchange for business favors. Now, Ms. Kim's husband, ousted leader Yoon Sung-yeol, is also behind bars, but at a separate detention center. He's been charged with insurrection over his martial law decree in December. Both are in solitary cells, given their status as the former presidential couple. Separately, a court hearing will be held on Wednesday to determine whether an arrest warrant would be issued for former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. He's alleged to have helped Yoon push through a decree for the martial law and betraying his constitutional duty by aiding in insurrection. The Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is rebounding in opinion polls, with memories of last month's election setback possibly fading. Now, his ruling Liberal Democratic Party lost its majority in the upper house. But a poll published by Japanese media Yomiuri Shimbun says that the approval rating for Mr. Ishiba's cabinet actually rose 17 points to 39%. With the exception of premiership changes, it's the biggest jump of any government since the survey started in 2008. A majority also think that Mr. Ishiba should remain in office rather than resign, marking a reversal from July. Yomiuri says that the recovery is likely due to the recent U.S. trade deal and efforts by the government to curb the rising price of rice. Polls conducted by other news sites showing similar change in attitudes. Surveys by Kyodo News and Mainichi Shimbun both also reporting an increase in support for the Japanese Prime Minister and his cabinet. Singapore and Japan have discussed ways to strengthen cooperation in trade, security, and in the digital and green sectors. In Tokyo, Singapore Senior Minister Lee Hsien Loong has been conferred one of Japan's most prestigious awards. It's for his contribution to fostering mutual understanding, friendship, and goodwill between the two countries. CNA's Myung Ishida has this report.
日本国天皇はシンガポール国人リ・シェンロンに旭日大綬章を贈与する。皇居において自ら名を書し辞をおさせる。御名国事。
The Order of the Rising Sun was established in 1875.
I thank Prime Minister Ishiba for his kind words, and I thank the people of Japan for this tremendous honor. I'm deeply humbled to receive this award, and I do so on behalf of generations of Singaporeans who have worked hard with their Japanese counterparts to strengthen our bilateral partnership over many decades.
SM Lee noted how the close partnership builds on compatible strategic perspectives and shared interests.
The world entering uncharted waters, it is more important than ever for us to strengthen this enduring partnership and work together to foster regional peace and prosperity and a rules-based multilateral order.
Those in attendance include former Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshimasa Hayashi, former Foreign Minister Taro Kono, who also chairs the Japan-Singapore Parliamentary Friendship League. SM Lee also held a meeting with Mr. Ishiba and was hosted to lunch. They took stock of the strong and broad-based bilateral relations which extended across political, economic, and people-to-people ties. They reaffirmed the lasting friendship between the two countries ahead of 60 years of diplomatic relations in 2026. Michio Ishida, CNA, Tokyo.
Indonesia and the United States have launched joint military drills that bring together allies from 11 nations. Well, the annual Super Garuda Shield exercise begins today and will run for more than a week. They're being held in the capital, Jakarta, as well as across Sumatra and the Riau Archipelago. More than 4,000 Indonesians and 1,300 American troops are taking part. 11 other countries, including Japan, South Korea, France, Britain, Australia, and Singapore, have deployed their military forces for the exercise as well. Now, the drills include staff planning, cyber defense training, and a live fire event. Indonesia's military says that the exercise will sharpen skills and boost deterrence among participants. Well, time now for another short break. But coming up next on East Asia Tonight, China's use of coal for power generation has surged, threatening its goal to rein in carbon emissions by 2030. And we'll take a look at Pyongyang's newly refreshed train stations. You're watching East Asia Tonight. Now, China's use of coal energy has surged, even as it added record levels of clean energy capacity. Well, that's according to a report by the Helsinki-based Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. In the first half of this year, China brought 21 gigawatts of coal power online. Well, that's the highest since 2016. And at the same time, coal projects totaling 46 gigawatts have either begun or restarted. That's the same amount of coal power that South Korea uses. Separately, China launched another 75 gigawatts worth of new or revived coal projects. And China has depended on coal to fuel its explosive growth in the past decades. But in recent years, its rapid growth in wind and solar installations have also made it a global renewable energy powerhouse. Still, the report says coal power will likely be in the system for years to come, as its development has shown no signs of easing. And that could threaten China's goal to peak carbon emissions within the next 5 years. Chinese President Xi Jinping pledged in 2021 to strictly control coal projects and consumption before an expected phase down between 2026 and 2030. Meantime, China's new mega dam project in Tibet has triggered fears in India that water flows on a major river will be cut drastically during the dry season. To mitigate the effects, Delhi has fast-tracked plans for its own dam in the border state of Arunachal Pradesh, but it's facing fierce resistance from the locals. The villagers of Parong fear that the dam project will threaten their way of life as they live off farms nourished by the river Siang. At least 16 Adi villages are likely to be lost to the project, directly affecting an estimated 10,000 people. But community leaders say more than 100,000 people will be impacted overall.
डैम को बनने से हम लोग तो कैसे खाएगा, इसलिए हम लोग बनने नहीं देगा। डैम बनने से तो सब माटी जाएगा। ये हम लोग तो ये माटी से बागान करता है, उस ये LIC बागान करता है, धान भी डालता है, ऐसे कोतल गाछ का ये भी पारता है, नाशपाती भी करता है, सब चीज करता है। उसी से हम लोग उसी का गाछ का निकालने वाला का सामान से हम लोग बिक्री करके बस्ता उस्ता को पड़ता है, हम लोग उसी से खाता है, इसलिए डैम बनने नहीं देगा।
Well, Indonesia is dealing with a measles outbreak in the East Java district of Sumeneb. Health authorities suspect that it was triggered by a decline in pediatric immunizations during the COVID-19 pandemic. At least 17 children have died, with some 2,000 infected. Authorities will begin vaccinations for 78,000 children today. The East Java government has delivered some 80,000 doses of vaccines as part of emergency immunization efforts to contain the outbreak. Majority of the children who have died in the latest outbreak had incomplete vaccination records. Well, in response to the alarming surge in infections, the Sumenap Health Agency has declared a public health emergency to strengthen containment and prevention efforts. The UN Children's Fund has warned that an alarming global surge in measles cases is posing a serious threat to children. And CNA's Saiful Bari Ismail tells us how Indonesia plans to contain the outbreak.
There are plans to widen the vaccination program to other areas in the country. Falling childhood immunization rates have already triggered outbreaks in at least 36 regions, not just in Sumenep. Between January and early August, the Health Ministry recorded 40 separate outbreaks nationwide. More than 22,000 suspected cases have been reported, with over 3,000 confirmed infections. Now, most of those infected are children between 1 and 4 years old. East Java has been worst hit province, followed by Aceh, North Sumatra and West Java. The Health Ministry says at least 95% of children need to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity against measles. To curb the spread, the government is ramping up immunization drives while also rolling out supporting measures, improving nutrition for children with measles, giving out vitamin A supplements to prevent severe infections, and running public education campaigns about the disease. In Sumenep, local officials believe the recent outbreak there was partly the result of falling immunization rate during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, during that time, many parents struggled to get their children vaccinated because health clinics were closed or short-staffed. Others delayed appointments over fears of virus exposure, while vaccine hesitancy also grew. The health agency says most of the children who died from measles had incomplete vaccination records, and some had never received a single dose at all.
Well, measles is actually a highly contagious viral infection that affects the respiratory system. It can spread through direct contact with the saliva or mucus of an infected child or adult through coughing, sneezing, or contact with contaminated surfaces. Symptoms usually appear 10 to 12 days after contact, and they include high fever, Koplik spots, which are tiny white spots inside the mouth, and red blotchy rashes that typically appear on the face before spreading down to other parts of the body. Measles can lead to serious complications such as pneumonia or swelling of the brain, and can be fatal, especially in children under the age of 5. Now, several preventive steps can be taken, including through the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. 2 doses of the MMR vaccine can provide lifelong protection. Herd immunity is crucial as it can help protect vulnerable groups. In Singapore, for instance, foreign domestic workers who look after young children but are not fully vaccinated against measles will have to get the 2-dose MMR vaccine starting next month. Now, some headlines from media outlets in East Asia. The South China Morning Post, citing an NGO report, says that 90% of low-income households in Japan are finding it tough to afford food for their children due to inflation and stagnant wages. A mother surveyed said that she lost weight and even collapsed at work due to hunger. Radio Television Hong Kong reports that the city's government has urged key scientific laboratories to better align with the country's strategic needs. Academics say they plan to leverage the city's proximity to the Greater Bay Area for further collaboration. And the Korea Times says more than 10,000 cryptocurrency investors in South Korea hold more than 1 billion won, or $750,000 on domestic exchanges. Most of these so-called crypto millionaires are in their 50s, but it's those in their 20s who have the highest average holdings. North Korea is modernizing several key train stations in the capital, all part of efforts to refresh Pyongyang's infrastructure. The updated designs aim to improve daily commutes and present a more modern image of the city.
Pyongyang's skyline is one that's rarely seen by anyone outside the country. New suburbs full of skyscrapers have sprung up in recent years. And underground, the city is also undergoing a makeover. At Yongwang Station, long escalators descend into a revamped space. The subway system was built starting in the 1960s, going into operation in the 1970s. Now, gone are the dim walls and heavy decor. In their place, lighter colors, sleek tiling, and electronic display panels.
오늘 변천된 평양의 모습은 세로 일대선 거리들뿐 아니라 우리 지하철도를 통해서도 체감할 수 있습니다. 지하철도 역사들은 수도 시민들의 교통상 편의를 보장하면서도 매 역들마다 주제별 특성에 맞게 건축과 장식, 조명을 비롯한 모든 것이 조형 예술화되었습니다.
Yongwang is one of several stops that have received a facelift. The Pyongyang Metro has just 2 lines and 16 stations, but it is a daily tool for local commuters, not a showpiece for tourists.
저는 보란봉역을 자주 이용하곤 합니다. 보란봉역의 사진 작품들을 볼 때마다 마음이 즐거워지곤 합니다.
Before the COVID-19 pandemic, foreign tourists were allowed access to the entire system. That access is now restricted. Tour groups remained locked out. Foreign residents in Pyongyang can, however, use the metro. But despite years of speculation, there are no signs of expansion. The subway lines do not reach Pyongyang's newer suburbs. These areas, filled with high-rise blocks, remained outside the network's reach. Still, the metro system remains a rare glimpse into the possibilities for North Korea's urban infrastructure. And for many who ride it daily, it is a reflection of the changing times above.
China's cinemas have been enjoying a boom lately, bucking the global trend of falling ticket sales. China's summertime season runs from June to August, and over 150 films were released, taking in more than 11 billion yuan, or about $1.5 billion as of this morning. Leading the box office is Dead to Rights, a war epic set during Japan's brutal occupation of Nanjing in 1937. And as of Sunday, it raked in more than $380 million. Animated films like Nobody and The Legend of Hei 2 also enjoying a good run. Their on-screen success driving a surge in movie merchandise sales, delivering 120% year-on-year growth in revenue. And hope you've enjoyed Monday's edition of East Asia tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And if you need to catch up more news, look to Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.